Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss Schmidt, Assange, and anarchy. Tim.
Assange was recently released or plea dealed, maybe at this time of recording about 3 weeks ago, and I'm very happy for Assange that he's out of prison. But my question today is: did Assange lose, or did the deep state win this fight with Assange? My answer to the question of whether Assange endangered the U.S. security state's interests by their interpretation is obviously yes. However, unlike the U.S. government, I think it's a good thing. So let's think about what Assange ended up being charged for. So the judge in Saipon, the place where the U.S. territory where he ended up pleading guilty in his plea deal, states there was a probe and found no direct victims, and used time served in Belmarsh as his punishment for the crime that he pleaded guilty to. That is great for Assange if you want to play autistic legal point scoring. But oddly enough, that makes his actions less heroic if he actually didn't cause any direct victims of the U.S. government. The point of journalism, especially if war crimes are involved, is to shed light and bring justice. If Assange didn't harm the U.S. military state, then in a way, did he do something wrong? But I actually think that's false. I think what the probe that did find him is is false. The point of prosecutions, whether from like the private sector, like journalists from Daniel Ellsberg, or the public sector. So if you're a New York State prosecutor, and you want to prosecute somebody, the point is to hurt the person. And that's, in a sense, part of quote-unquote justice. If you think about the Trump prosecution, which has now been dropped or went away, it's to suck legal fees out of him, make an example out of him, put him in, and lastly, put him in jail. And that's the same thing. I think one of the episodes you said, Swithin, that the point of the prosecution against Assange was that the process was the punishment. So yes, the process punished Assange. I mean, so in a strange sense, this was a victimless crime by the U.S. government's supposed ruling. But I actually don't think it is a victimless crime. But I think that the U.S. security interest did do, to a certain extent, what it wanted. So the U.S. regime managed to make an example out of Assange as a whistleblower. And this is actually as people like Daniel Ellsberg, who died recently, but Judge Napolitano, Jimmy Dore, Max Blumenthal, a number of commentators. I'll stick to the libertarian ones, like Judge Napolitano said, this is terrible ruling, the plea deal. This is an absolutely terrible ruling. So even him getting freedom after 5 years in Belmarsh comes only at the cost of pleading guilty in a plea deal. Which suggests to me that the deep state won this fight. They did three things. They made an example out of him. They got to get this precedence here. And still Assange reports that they're going to try to continue to appeal this. But we'll see if they ever overthrow this here. And finally, did anyone that Assange go after in the Iraq war logs or any of the releases get punished, or let alone that maybe they paid a small political price, but did they really pay any major political price? No. So on that counts, I hate to be black-pilled here, but it just seems like in some sense it failed. Yes, the information was released. Yes, all the fringes like you and I and the far left and certain honest centrists and honest classical liberals, to the extent that there are them, know about this stuff. But it's not mainstream. And that's one of the problems of the dissident media, is that you don't get the mainstream news. At least Ellsberg ended the Vietnam War. Now you could say the Afghanistan eventually ended. Therefore, in some sense, Assange has a role in that. Sure, Assange, in a way, but that wound down, ironically enough, under Trump and Biden. Trump himself, and this is the Trump. I'm against Trump for the reasons that you're not supposed to be against Trump for. And one of the things that some of the Assange defenders point out is that Trump's security apparatus tried to assassinate Assange when he was in the embassy in there. But I'm not really here to talk about Trump here. I want to more talk about Assange here. In the sense that Trump relates, we can talk about it. So my question here is, can a modern managerial state, internationally or domestically, exist without secrets? Because I think that's the real thing that Assange did, is he dumped secret documents. And that's the somewhat critique that Ellsberg also had with him. Now, Ellsberg lived in the 70s, so he had, Glenn Greenwald talks about this, how he'd go to make a million, he had to make phone copies at a dollar store, basically, a photocopies at a dollar store with his documents here. So with the internet age, and we have all these emails from Hillary Clinton, from random State departments, and all these recordings of these F-16s and drones, can a modern managerial state exist without secrets? So first of all, don't say some wealthy microstate, although even those wealthy microstates probably have lots of secrets. And don't say someplace like Norway that has like no defense policy. You have to be a real society here, because I think if the answer is no, so we're anarchists, and the answer is no, then in some sense, and this goes back to Schmitt, in some sense, for the state to remain sovereign, it has to, and Schmitt is very much a theorist of sovereign. The state has to have secrets here. John Mearsheimer talks about this, lying in politics. Although John Mearsheimer supports Julian Assange, although he supports him for technical reasons, not for like anarchist reasons here. So I guess there is some sort of defense here. So Swithin, did the deep state, managerial state, or whatever you want to say, win? And number two is, can a state exist without secrets in the modern world? Thanks for doing this episode.
No, I don't. I don't think the state can exist without secrets for two reasons. One, when it comes to ostensibly democratic states, if their legitimizing ideology is the consent of the governed, they can't go too far outside popular opinion, such that maybe some potential counter elite could gain power because the existing structure is losing its legitimacy, say Tsarist Russia or something like that. So I think that's one thing that they would need to take into account. And additionally as well, even if you had a monarchy, people still need to buy into what the monarch does and thinks that the monarch is legitimate in some sense. Otherwise, they won't acquiesce in the appropriate sense, and so they won't be able to get what they want to do done. So I think they're going to need secrets. Now, then the question arises: well, why wouldn't the state be able to operate in such a great and open and honest fashion such that it wouldn't need secrets? Well, there are clearly things, even if this was, let's say, not the state, but some sort of anarchist community, which had its own defense and whatever, there are certain things you do not want potential enemies to know. And so you're going to, because that's going to give you a tactical advantage over them. The fact that they don't know what you've got and where can give you a tactical advantage. That said, of course, you could always have a tactical advantage in a sense of being really open and showing, look, you know how to get in, but you can't because it's too hard. But it does seem to be said, at least historically, that having the element of surprise is highly valuable. So having secrets in that sense is kind of necessary, even if they weren't doing kind of bad stuff, like the collateral murder video or something like that, which is the famous thing from sort of the Assange years. We then have an additional question, which is, can the state survive with only enforcing secrets in those people who have signed an agreement? So what seems to be the case is, when it comes to whistleblowers, to journalists, is that people who may have signed something similar to, so in England, in the UK, you have the Official Secrets Act. And so if you're in a particular position, you sign a document which says you will not divulge sensitive data to people. But then the question is, well, should people who are told secrets by somebody who shouldn't have told them, should the person who's been told be allowed to tell anybody else? Because that really gets into the whole journalism question. If not, then people like Ellsberg or whatever, or the New York Times should be tried and prosecuted, which is essentially what they did to WikiLeaks. Or if you take the view that, well, no, they shouldn't be bound by it because they didn't agree to be bound by the contract, then they should be allowed to say that. And then the question is, can the state survive in that case? Well, it kind of depends on what the kind of things that people are going to divulge. So that's interesting. So I think that's contingent on what you actually do as a state. And the type of person you get. Clearly, if you get agents from foreign governments or whatever, then that becomes more of a problem. The interesting thing is, when it comes to kind of like official secrets and blocking journalism and things, it's really a form of intellectual property. Because if you have two parties that say, oh, well, I buy your work, I'll agree not to copy it and sell it to somebody else. But if someone does that, so if we both agree to do that, and I then sell it to Jeff, under like copyright law, Jeff is liable, that's how the intellectual property thing works. And that was how sort of secrets might work if you prevented journalism. It would be the equivalent of going after Jeff. Well, I think you shouldn't go after Jeff in either case. And I do think you could probably get away with it. I think to the extent that the state does serious unpleasant things and maybe is bad at hiring people, then you might, on a pragmatic basis, defend that kind of government secrets intellectual property. But in the absence of it, I don't think that's particularly necessary. So yeah, those would be sort of my opening thoughts on secrets and how one might enforce secrets.
Your point about the Secrets Act and the Espionage Act here in the United States being a form of intellectual property is entirely correct, which is one of the points why I think only anarchists in some ways can fully cheer on what Assange did. Because I think you have to sort of, in a way, abolish if you abolish intellectual property, you might abolish many of these Secrets Acts here. But this goes back to the question of privacy here. And I do think, to go back to the Assange thing, I do think the state managed to get damages off Assange by making an example out of him, even though they only got a small plea deal. So in that regard, success, unfortunately, for the state here. But the question of whether the Secrets Act, whether it is legitimate, goes back to the question of the Carl Schmittian question here, and like what makes a legitimate state here. And if a legitimate, do legitimate states require secrets? And I think the state that grew up around the war logs, the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and the state that grew up around the Vietnam War, and became increasingly, for those actions, illegitimate. The problem is, I think anarchists know that in some strange sense, the war is not the exception. Actually, increasingly, like if you think about how we started our show about COVID here, there's all sorts of secrets here that more or less released, or we sort of knew about, or not so secret here about various things. If they get released and people hear about them, are people going to be particularly, quote unquote, happy with their society? Will they think their society? Will they think or the state, more likely? Will they think the state is, quote unquote, legitimate here? So, in my opinion, like if you think, if you're like these sort of classical liberals or the progressive classical liberals like Mises, who think the state is a necessity, or progressives, of course, who think the state is also a necessity, then in a way you need something like immunity for politicians here, if indeed the state basically is criminal. I think the Assange has a quote, if it's criminal to tell the truth about the state, then you're ruled by criminals here. So, but I think anarchists sort of intuitively know that the state, anarchists of the left and anarchists of the right, like the Rothbardians and such, you and I know that the state is, in a way, just a very well-dressed gang. Well, maybe not well-dressed or legitimized gang, which then goes back to the Schmittian questions here. Is the doc, for like Edward Snowden, if he was a contractor, and of course he signed, some version of those acts here, and was that a legitimate contract with a legitimate organization he signed? And I think the only answer to that question is no. Unless you think the state is legitimate and you think that those contracts are legitimate. But then can you actually have a modern state without those contracts? Because the real state that exists in the past 150 years seems to only exist. It's not a surprise to me that the Federal Reserve, World War I, and all these other things, and the New Deal. And again, different societies have similar developments here. But I'm just using the American context here. Happen right when the Espionage Act roughly happens too, so you could modern states here. So that's my pushback. That's my second round of comments regarding this here. I'm going to ask you: do you think the regime was technically correct in its ruling? And do you think the regime was correct to go correct, not from a moral point of view, Swithin, but from a point of view of protecting its PR, so to speak, in going after Assange? Now, you could try to make the argument that it got worse PR going after Julian Assange than it would have just had him released. But then, if you're a regime defender, then you have to think, well, would more whistleblowers come forward if indeed we didn't bloody his kneecaps up, which is basically what they you could argue they did. So, what do you make about that question?
I think they certainly would have put people off. I think they ended up. I think ideally they would have wanted to try him and put him in prison forever. I do think that would have been ideal, but the British judicial system started putting up a modicum of a fight. The argument being, I think, that the reasoning was something like, oh, if he has to go on trial for a crime in America for which no non-American citizens have ever been tried for on the Espionage Act, you have to try him as an American citizen, and therefore he would then be able to use First Amendment defenses, which prior to that they'd always rejected. So they couldn't try him anymore. Although why it took so long for the British judicial system to do that is interesting, at least. But they kept him in high security jail for 5 years. He's incredibly ill, and they technically got him to plead guilty. And I don't think people are going to think, oh, I can whistleblow or I can release secrets and the thing will happen to me. I can essentially be thrown away without a trial. Now, granted, yes, he was put in prison because he skipped bail and whatever, but that was solely because he was concerned that the Americans are going to use the somewhat lurid sexual offences stuff he was accused of in Sweden as a pretext to extradite him. So essentially, he's been entirely correct that was going to be the case. But yeah, I think the question is: are people now more or less likely to divulge American secrets? It seems that they're going to be less likely. As I was saying though before, I mean, I suppose whether or not, going back to the more specific thing on sort of the IP of state secrets, the question is really how bad does the state need to be to maintain power? So if you treat it as a mafia gang, how nasty does the mafia gang need to be to maintain power? And I think that's going to depend on whether the local population believe the gang is legitimate. So I suppose it might be more necessary in a democratic state than it would be in a monarchical state, because there's a more clearly accepted asymmetry of what's just and what's unjust, whereas the monarch can do what he sees fit within certain restrictions, more so than the embodiment of the will of the people in the form of the president or something like that. It'd be interesting. It would depend on the case-by-case basis. But I mean, it's interesting though, because I mean, you could argue really that there's really only a few genuine states. So you could argue maybe China and the USA are, because you could say, well, really, there's just a few world empires, and the question is, who are you under? Otherwise, well, you don't really need to do anything because, well, you're effectively an outpost to the US. So you might say, oh, Switzerland is really an outpost to the US, and just need to be doing nasty things. For instance, because they just sort of outsource it to the CIA or something, or the US Marine Corps or something. So yeah, I'm tempted, if you take seriously the idea of the mafia gangs, then possibly, but I think it very much depends on the legitimizing ideology and what people are willing to take, and also especially the people who work for the government. If people who work for the government believe what they're doing is right and are perfectly happy with doing it, they're not going to hear whistleblowers anyway, and therefore no information. Now, clearly, people could hack in, but no one, I don't know any evidence of that actually happening without any help at all from the inside. As an aside on PR for the government and hacking and stuff, there was a theory I read, for instance, that the reason Edward Snowden got out with this stuff on the NSA, well, the argument was that there was inter-agency rivalry between the CIA and the NSA, and apparently that Snowden was a CIA asset and got him to spill the beans on the NSA because they didn't like them for whatever reason. I don't remember. But that's at least interesting. Yeah, those would be my thoughts as to whether or not you could get away with a state operation without any sort of Secrets Act as such.
Assange is a very heroic person, so I want to start with that here. However, I do think that he went up against one of the most powerful gangs, and I think they definitely made an example out of him to some extent. So if you want to release secrets or even publish secrets, you really have to question, how much are you going to pay here? How much are you willing to pay, and how much do you want to endure here? So in that regard, especially about the people you went after, because I think it's real crime, as many conservative and libertarian commentators was releasing secrets about the Clintons, which allowed Bernie Sanders, releasing secrets about the Clintons more or less was his crime, which the Democratic Party process here, that was the real thing that pissed a certain number of people off here, which I brought up in our interview with the free Julian Assange guy we did maybe 3 years ago, early in our show. But my last question is, as far as Assange himself, and again, I want to study, I think Assange is an absolute hero for what he did in this sense. But as some people point out, the precedent that was set is terrible here, and bringing him, if they would have forced him to bring him to the United States, would the trial been more damaging to the regime than the plea deal? Because the plea deal they can sort of hide away and forget about, but just to file the precedent in here. And so, what made Assange? In some sense, you have to ask, did Assange, being this single guy, was he good martyr material here? Would it have been better if the CIA actually just assassinated him? Does this in any way, quote unquote, I'm not going to say taint his legacy, but you do have to ask the question here. They got a plea deal out of him, and again, you could just say the whole government is criminal, but it seems like it seems like anarchism isn't particularly, in the broad sense, particularly popular. So maybe history probably will view Julian Assange very well, but will they view him taking this deal very well, or will they just try to forget about it the same way the regime sort of wants to forget about this and sort of just send him back to Australia here? And I will point out, the reason why he's free is it seems like the British state and British legal system asserted its own sovereignty, basically by saying British and Australia. So to go back to the Schmidt point regarding sovereignty, it seems like the reason he's free is not based on the First Amendment. It's based on the fact that, the British elites and Australian elites, more or less, took this, eventually started taking this as an affront to them, not necessarily, not necessarily affront to their own securities. Not that was more of the reason why Assange did end up getting the plea deal. But if he got the plea deal, you have to think, if he held out longer, could he eventually just gotten a full pardon from somebody, or just have the case dropped? So that's my final question. I know we're somewhat time limited today, and this is a shorter topic anyway. So, with any comments about this? That's probably my last comment.
I do think it would have been interesting if he went to trial. If he was allowed to use First Amendment defenses, then I think that would have done serious damage to the US government. If he was tried and they somehow could have got around that would have been even better for them, because then they could put him away for serious amounts of time. The plea deal, I was pleased that Assange got out. I mean, I understand why he took it. I think his argument was, yes, I recognize that I would be convicted in the court of this, but I would have defended it on this grounds, but I recognize that you didn't accept those arguments. I think that was the language, but the way it looks like is, he was guilty, at least by the standards of the American government. So I was uneasy. I was concerned about how it would play out long term. But I think how the US government, I think when it comes to agencies and being able to leak things online and things, I think you might end up with people dropping stuff in other places. I think it might dissuade people to some extent, but given what seems to be an increasing concern or lack of belief in sort of the American permanent institutions, you might still get quite a lot of leaking anyway, although how easy or well that's going to work, I don't know. It would be interesting if Assange is out and gets better, whether WikiLeaks will actually get up and running again, because it did basically seem to be him plus extras. So, yeah, I don't know normie views on this, so I don't know whether normies think Assange good or Assange bad, but certainly it officially looks bad, and people go, "Oh yes, but look, the court said this." There's annoying people say, "Oh, yeah, but the court's ruled this." It's like, yeah, but why is the court right? It's like, no, the court said. So I am mildly, moderately concerned about what could happen going forward with this. Now, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.